I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close-Up. On this program, we feature leading newsmakers and the New York Times journalists who cover them. This week, Humanities education on the defensive. We'll connect with a former Poet Laureate and award-winning teacher and writer to hear why fostering skills that don't directly contribute to the bottom line should nonetheless remain a top priority. But first, is subway etiquette getting better or worse? Whatever happened to manners and civility? Times Metro Reporter Ana Ley kicked off a citywide conversation on the topic with her recent Times article, Does Anyone Know How to Behave on the Subway Anymore? And that sort of implied that we knew how to behave before. Are we getting worse or better?
Well, I think it's just sort of people coming back from the pandemic and relearning things because, you know, these rules were sort of on pause while everyone was away. Meanwhile, you've got, you know, people moving into the city who didn't have, people to emulate. They didn't have New Yorkers, you know, to take a lead from. And so you've got everyone sort of figuring it all out at the same time as ridership comes up. And so sometimes, you know, tensions can flare up a little bit in the system when people don't know where to stand or, you know, when to sit down.
I remember when I was a kid growing up in Brooklyn, there were some written rules. They advertised no smoking, no spitting, of all things. I don't even see that now. But what are the unwritten rules that you talk about?
Some of them are, you know, kind of hard to figure out if you're not from here. You know, no eye contact. Do not make eye contact with strangers. Someone wrote to me recently who said no skin-to-skin contact. You know, so if you're holding onto a pole, do not touch a stranger.
No touching.
No touching. You know, what other rules? Yeah, you know, just not standing in people's way if they're trying to get out. Someone else wrote to me and said, it drives me crazy when someone gets up from their seat to exit the train right when their stop comes up. Like, you got to do it before so you're not scrambling and people have to kind of get out of your way. So there's a lot of little rules that people pick up as they ride.
Now, are these rules or gripes? Are people just cranky, or are these things that actually impede travel? You talk about, you know, loud music on cell phones, that tinny sound, people talking on cell phones, people putting makeup on. How do all these things rate in the scale of, you know, manners and civility?
I think there's probably different gradients here, right, in terms of what's most offensive and least offensive. But at the bottom, or at the end of the day, you know, I think some of these rules are important because they sort of maintain order in the system. And I think the people that are especially impacted are people who have a hard time getting around, maybe people who use wheelchairs or people, you know, pregnant women or you know, people who are more vulnerable, you know, if there's chaos in the system. And so, you know, I spoke with a really smart professor at NYU, a social psychologist, who explained it to me, and that, you know, it just sort of signals that you respect other people, you know, when you sort of follow this unwritten code. And when you don't, you know, people can get mad at each other, and that's not a good thing to have in a system where there's so many people packed into a really tight space.
Are any of these unwritten rules being codified as written? Spreading your arms and legs, anything about putting backpacks on empty seats, stinky food. I remember there was an attempt to ban food on the subways, not very successful. Is the MTA thinking of making rules like this?
So there are some rules, you know, taking up more than one seat actually is an infraction. You can get punished for that. You know, smoking in the system is not allowed. That is a formal rule that, you know, you can get in trouble with the law.
Vaping?
No vaping. Yeah. So there are certainly actual rules, you know, but as far as the more informal ones, the MTA actually recently launched an advertising campaign, which basically encourages people to be nice to each other, to not put makeup on in the subway, to, you know, not bump into everyone with your backpack, you know, to not leave trash, or, you know, basically to just kind of behave.
I have to say my biggest gripe is when someone gets up to give me a seat. It tells me how old I must look or don't feel. But there are a lot of people who don't get up in the seats that are reserved for people who are elderly or someone disabled, when they're sitting in those seats that are clearly marked and just sit there, sort of semi-comatose like slugs.
Yeah, there was actually a campaign a few years ago, again by the MTA, where they were giving pregnant women these pins that you could, wear while you were writing, and it would say, please give up your seat for me. And from what I recall reading that coverage, it was not very successful.
What was the reaction you got from readers? I saw you got hundreds of comments in nytimes.com.
Yeah, we got, I think, almost 1,000 comments on that story. It really took off in a way that I was not expecting. I'm still getting emails about it from people all over the world, people who said, I rode the subway in, 1985, I'm from Tokyo. It's insane how much people relate to this. I think the subway is just, I don't know, a source once described it as the most famous public space in America. And I think people just have this really intense curiosity about it and really also equally intense feelings about it.
People had a lot of anecdotes. Did any have any constructive ideas as to how to promote manners?
Oh gosh. Most of the comments that I've gotten have been stories. There was a woman who described herself as 4'10", who said, I'm tired of people bumping their backpacks into me, and there should be a backpack with sensors on it that allows you to feel if you're touching someone, sort of this like cyborg situation. But I'll be honest, I can't recall anyone say anything that isn't new or different or innovative, that the MTA isn't already trying, I think.
You talk about the MTA's campaign on politeness. Can you teach people to be polite?
I think that some people would say yes, and some people would say no. Some people that I spoke with in the system said, "Oh, that's great. Like, it's good that they're kind of reminding people about this etiquette." But one writer from the Bronx he said it was just foolishness. So he didn't think that people would actually follow rules. He just sort of thinks that the MTA is wasting its time.
Anna, you pointed out that the number of summons being issued is up about 55%. Do people answer these summons regularly, or do they vanish into the ozone?
I think it probably depends on the type of infraction, but I do think that a lot of times the people that tend to get in trouble, unfortunately, tend to be poor, or tend to, just not have the wherewithal to address these things. And so, that's something that I think the NYPD and the MTA probably grapple with.
The satisfaction rate, a sort of mystical marker, the MTA strives for 70%. I'm not sure where they get that figure. At the moment, it's about 38%. Has it ever been 70%?
I'm not sure. They changed the methodology recently for how they do some of these surveys. Like they've been doing them more frequently, and so I'm not sure that it's apples to apples compared to how they used to do these surveys. But I will say that satisfaction rates did plummet during the pandemic as people were feeling really uneasy about their safety, and that's something that the authority has really put a lot of effort into, which is why summonses are up and why there's so many cops in the system, and and there's cameras being installed on every car, 2 per car, and so they're really trying to not only make the system safer, but also make the system feel safer, because crime is actually down, which I think surprises some people. Certainly, when I meet people at parties or in social functions, people are sort of surprised. They're like, "Oh, I thought crime was up," but it's actually not. It's down. But sometimes the perception, I think, really is different, and especially when we have really terrible incidents like the pushing of a woman onto the tracks a few weeks ago. I think that stuff, these sort of urban nightmares really affect people.
And one of the solutions to that, or proposed solution, is gates on the platform. Is that really feasible? I mean, is that going to happen at every subway station, or is that, some sort of dream?
Platform barriers? Yeah, so that is, the MTA has a pilot program going to try to install them at some stations, very few. And, they've said for a long time that the infrastructure just wouldn't support them. They're too heavy. And I'm talking about these glass barriers that you might see in the London Tube. Those are really expensive, and they're also, according to the MTA, just difficult to install in the system, especially because some of the cars are different sizes, so you can't really line them up. Some people have said, well, maybe you could do metal barriers, but again, you run into logistics issues. And they're also waiting on congestion pricing money to do this.
What a segue. Give us a quick update on congestion pricing.
Yeah, so we're all kind of biting our nails right now, waiting for the Traffic Mobility Review Board to come out with their sort of proposed tolls. That group is the locally appointed, what do I call it? It's a group of people that was locally appointed that is going to ultimately decide what people are going to pay to come into the congestion pricing zone, which of course is in Lower Manhattan. And we're all sort of anxiously waiting, and there's also a lawsuit in New Jersey and another that was filed in a local court. And Phil Murphy is also threatening to sue the MTA directly because the Jersey suit is being filed against the federal government. So there's all this litigation and all this sort of wrangling over discounts and exemptions to the tolls, and there's a lot of balls in the air right now. And I think that's kind of the story of the day right now in the transit world.
Ana Ley of the Metro section of the New York Times, thank you for joining us. And coming up next, we'll talk about the shifting value of education and the value of the humanities. The bean counters are targeting your college major due to increasing budget cuts and declining enrollment. Colleges and universities have had to reduce humanities funding in favor of majors more suited to filling jobs. In a down economy, why should we prioritize literature and creative writing programs? Joining us from Mississippi is Beth Fennelly, an award-winning writer, teacher, former Mississippi Poet Laureate, guest opinion essayist for the New York Times, and her most recent book, Heating and Cooling, 52 Micro Memoirs. Beth, in the New York Times, you wrote recently that we should stop corporatizing your students. What did you mean by that?
Well, Sam, what I mean by that is we've shifted education to pretend that students are entry-level employees that are contracting at the university to receive a job when they graduate. And that shift toward speaking of them in business terms and only looking at financial outcomes that are directly replied to workplace readiness is allowing us to change the way we think of education. We're not thinking of students as people who were training how to think better, write better, be better humans, participate in a democracy. We're training them now to be entry-level employees. And it's really shifted our priorities in terms of what we're funding, and I wanted to call attention to that.
Is the problem also, though, that we have demeaned vocational education? I mean, don't we need a lot of people who fill jobs as carpenters, engineers, mechanics, and we've said everyone ought to go to college, get a liberal arts education, and what kind of job do you get with that?
Right. I actually think it's the opposite that's happened, that we've swung the pendulum too far in the other direction, that humanities now are being devalued. I do know a lot of people who are worried about the cost of college education, and I agree with them. I myself have 3 kids, one who's just graduated, 2 are coming up into college. I think a lot about the cost of college education. The cost of college education has greatly increased over the years, and it's disproportionate. I'm definitely not disagreeing with that, but the costs of college tend to have different sources now. For example, bloated administrative salaries or football coaches making $10 million a year. Those might be areas where we should look at, as opposed to saying we no longer should be teaching foreign languages. We shouldn't be giving students English classes. We need to cut anthropology majors. We need to cut history and philosophy majors. And those are very real arguments that are happening in many, many places right now, especially strapped public universities in southern states.
Beth, and why are the universities shifting that focus? Why are they making that priority decision?
Well, I think that there are a lot of reasons, Sam, but I think there is a kind of anti-intellectualism that is paired with this idea that we should be suspicious of the humanities, and tying jobs to workplace readiness then means students are being nudged toward the vocational. We're suggesting, for example, here in Mississippi, our Mississippi State Auditor, Shad White, just put out a report. In it, he suggested that students need to stay in Mississippi if they've been educated in Mississippi. And to get them to stay, we only should fund majors in which they'll have jobs when they graduate, because if they have jobs when they graduate, they're more likely to stay. So he suggests that we defund philosophy, anthropology, English, and fund instead majors like construction management. Now, there's nothing wrong with construction management, but that he suggests students should be nudged into that field. There's something wrong with that, because what it implies then is only wealthy people are good enough for the humanities. Students in a poor state, Mississippi is the poorest state in the nation, don't deserve to study the humanities. They're not worthy of studying the humanities. And what that's going to do is create this, underclass of resentment, really, that feels a lot of antipathy toward the upper class, the people who did get to go to elite liberal arts colleges. And we've seen how that played out in the 2016 election.
This may sound demeaning, it's not meant to, but why would an electrician, a mechanic, want to learn the humanities, or what would he or she get out of it?
Sam, I believe that every human is interested in humanity, and everyone deserves to be curious. Everyone deserves to read and think and lead a fulfilled life. And studying the humanities is a way of educating the emotions. And we think our emotions are perfectly clear and accessible. That's actually very rarely the case. The types of fields that encourage you to think of your life not like you're a cup that needs to be filled up with facts, but that you're a candle that's being lit, that you're someone who's being taught to think and appreciate life for your entire life, not just for the months in which it takes you to get your first entry-level job. I think that's the kind of education that everyone is deserving of, no matter how wealthy or poor you are.
You've been teaching for a while. Is there less critical thinking going on the part of students?
Well, this is anecdotal, but I would have to say yes. I do think that there's less critical thinking. I think education has changed a lot. I've been teaching in 21 years here at the University of Mississippi. I'm 52 now. And I would have to say, in general, both at my university and across the nation, students are less prepared to think critically. And I think they're more vulnerable then to something like fake news or demagoguery. They have less critical reasoning skills. They're less able to synthesize difficult ideas, and they are less able to speak and master complex ideas.
Why is that? Because they're not studying the humanities or something comparable before they get to college?
Yes, that's right. We've changed our education in the lower systems, teaching toward the test. A lot of teachers now are, frustrated in the way that they have less autonomy in the classroom. And I think we see that, the opposite of kind of trickle down. It's like trickling up to where, I get the students, and sometimes they really have difficulties writing a basic paragraph.
I don't want you to get involved or enmeshed in a quad fight, but what about things like algebra? I had to study algebra, I had to study trigonometry, of absolutely no use to me the rest of my life. Should we be dropping things like that in favor of the humanities?
I wouldn't necessarily say we should be dropping math or algebra in favor of the humanities. I would suggest we take a look at the way we're framing students as entry-level employees, and that our job is to get them a job, a job when they graduate. Because college has gotten so expensive, we feel forced into this terrible economy of thinking about an education is only going to result in the very first job. But in the article that I published in yesterday's New York Times, I got, hundreds of replies. And a lot of them were, English majors or professors saying, I'm so glad you wrote this. But the most interesting and valuable ones were people saying, I'm the CEO of a company with 7,000 people, and I look to hire humanities majors because I know they're nimble thinkers. I know that they can communicate. So many people outside of the humanities wrote to me about how valuable humanities graduates are in the workplace. And I found that really interesting.
A couple of years ago, the New York Times asked poets laureate from around the country what people in their states had to be thankful for. Now, we're coming up again on Thanksgiving. What's changed from the last time we asked that question? You were one of the people we asked.
Yes, I wrote about gratitude toward my state of Mississippi. It's actually my adopted state, but I consider myself very deeply grounded here. I have 3 children with deep Southern accents.
Although you're from New Jersey.
Yeah, I was born in New Jersey. I lived there till I was 5, but that seems a long time ago now. I do feel a lot of gratitude toward the state of Mississippi, which has made an outsized contribution to American arts and letters with our music, with our literature. William Faulkner's house, not 1 mile from where I'm speaking to you right now, Sam. This small, contentious state has had an outsized impact on American letters, and I'm grateful for it.
Beth Ann, you said that you're not alone among your colleagues in finding that students are more emotionally fragile, more easily distracted, more burdened, more burnout, slower to absorb some of the texts that you've been teaching for 20 years. Why is that?
Well, Sam, I actually do have several ideas on how the pressures on young people have been affecting them. One is the aforementioned fear of college debt. A second one is now young people are aware of environmental degradation in a way that people weren't when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s. And I think the fear that the planet is going to destroy itself is very real for them and weighs on them a lot. Third, that school shootings happen so frequently and that students have to be scared of going to school, I think has a big impact on, gun violence has created so much trauma for young people. And fourth, I would say the dependence on social media and telephones has bifurcated their powers of reflection and has weakened their critical reasoning skills.
So
and
what
I think
can,
these
go ahead.
They're weaker.
So what can teachers like you do about that?
Well, honestly, for me, teaching students how to read and to find solace in books is a very real medicine. It's a slow medicine, but a powerful medicine.
Beth Ann Fennelly, thank you for joining us, the former Poet Laureate of Mississippi, teaching at the University of Mississippi, and her most recent book, Heating and Cooling, 52 Micro Memoirs. And coming up next, I'll share some personal thoughts on what we don't know about history. Why was Ebenezer Stevens, a Boston Tea Party patriot, belatedly honored the other day in Brooklyn? As James Barron explained in the Times' New York Today newsletter, Stevens appears to have been the only Tea Party participant buried in New York City, in Greenwood Cemetery to be precise. Boston beat New York to the Tea Party, but not by much. Along with ships bound for Boston and other East Coast ports, the merchant ship Nancy sailed for New York on September 27, 1773, with 80 chests of tea. All the vessels were supposed to arrive simultaneously, but the Nancy lost a mast and anchor in a gale in the British West Indies. The ship didn't make it to New York until the following spring. When it arrived, rebellious New Yorkers refused to let it dock. When a second ship, the London, arrived, a New York mob dumped its taboo tea in the harbor, their gusto undiminished by the fact that the first post-tax tea ship had arrived in Boston 4 months earlier. We all know also about the Boston Massacre in 1770, but the first blood of the revolution was actually shed in Manhattan 6 weeks before that. An altercation between the rambunctious Sons of Liberty and increasingly spiteful British troops ended in violence on Golden Hill, a former wheat field not far from the East River. Coming up this month are 2 other overlooked anniversaries. November 25th is Evacuation Day. It marks the departure of British troops from New York in 1783 after 7 years of brutal occupation. New York is also where George Washington issued his Thanksgiving Proclamation when he was president in 1789. We're also only a New York minute away from what ought to be a robust commemoration of the city's quadricentennial. Pick whichever year you like, 1624, 1625, or 1626, when Peter Minuit executed what was either the best real estate deal or worse swindle when he believed he bought Manhattan Island. A commemoration doesn't have to be a celebration that overlooks historical sins, but it is a time to reflect on our past, a time to place the present in perspective, and a time to reimagine the future and to seize it. The mayor has had other things on his mind, so maybe someone else should convene a NYC 400 committee. Otherwise, like in 1774, we'll be late for the party. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.